They had locked the gates to my family's farm with industrial chains when I pulled up that Thursday afternoon. My heart stopped when I spotted the bright orange "Property Seized" notice plastered across the century-old oak door. Behind it stood Marcus Wellington, HOA president, arms crossed over his polo shirt, smirking like he'd just won the lottery. 90 days of unpaid association dues, he announced, brandishing a folder of papers. The board voted unanimously to foreclose. You should have opened your mail, soldier. What Marcus and his precious Meadowcrest Estates Homeowners Association didn't realize, what would come crashing down on them like a tactical airstrike in the days ahead, was that while I'd been deployed overseas, I hadn't just been serving my country. I'd been quietly acquiring the land trust that owned every inch of property their McMansions were built on. They hadn't seized my family farm. They'd just declared war on their landlord. 3 months earlier, life had been relatively peaceful. After 12 years of military service, including 4 combat deployments, I was finally heading home to take over the family farm. The Blackwood Farm had been in my family for 6 generations. 30 acres of rich soil and heritage that had survived. Wars, the Great Depression, and multiple attempts by developers to buy us out. My grandfather had resisted until his last breath, and my father had continued the tradition even as modern homes began to spring up around our property line. When the Meadowcrest Estates development went in 15 years ago, our farm became completely surrounded by cookie-cutter luxury homes and asphalt streets with pretentious names like Saddlebrook Way and Wellington Heights Circle. The developers had tried everything to get us to sell, offers that doubled with each rejection, thinly veiled threats about property devaluation, even attempts to influence local zoning boards. But the Blackwoods had held firm, becoming an island of agricultural tradition in a sea of suburban sprawl. Eventually, the developers had been forced to build around us. The HOA that formed afterward treated our farm like an eyesore from day one. Their first president, a reasonable woman named Rebecca Chen, had established a professional, if chilly, relationship with my father. They didn't like us, but they respected our property rights. That changed 5 years ago when Marcus Wellington, former real estate investor turned full-time HOA tyrant, took over as president. The harassment began almost immediately. Complaints about tractor noise during quiet hours, citations for improperly stored agricultural equipment visible from HOA properties, accusations that our free-range chickens were livestock at large. My father, stubborn but fair-minded, had fought them at every turn, maintaining that as a pre-existing property that never joined their association, we were exempt from their rules. When Dad passed away last year while I was stationed overseas, the farm went into a caretaker arrangement. My father's will was clear. The property would transfer to me upon my return from active duty. What I hadn't told anyone was that during my years of service, I'd been investing nearly every penny of my combat pay and bonuses. While the HOA thought I was just another grunt in desert camo, I'd been building a surprisingly substantial portfolio. 6 months before my discharge, a unique opportunity presented itself. Franklin Land Holdings, the company that owned the land underneath Meadowcrest Estates, was quietly looking to liquidate some assets. In one of those twists of fate that seems too perfect to be true, I learned that every house in Meadowcrest was built on leased land, not owned property. The homeowners owned their structures, but paid ground leases that most had forgotten about since the fees were bundled into their HOA dues. Using a shell company and with the help of my financial advisor, I began acquiring shares in Franklin Land Holdings. By the time I returned stateside, Blackwood Investment Group owned controlling interest in the company that legally owned the land under every pristine lawn and infinity pool in Meadowcrest Estates. I had planned to be reasonable about it. The land lease arrangement was profitable but fair. I had no intention of disturbing anyone's life, not even Marcus Wellington's, despite years of his petty tyranny against my family. I just wanted to tend my farm, honor my father's legacy, and live in peace. That's why I'd kept my ownership quiet initially. No need to create neighborhood drama when I was still adjusting to civilian life. That plan evaporated the moment I saw those chains on my gate and the smug satisfaction on Marcus's face. "You can't do this," I told him, my voice steady despite the rage building inside me. "This farm has never been part of your association. You have no jurisdiction here." Marcus's smile widened as he handed me a thick envelope. "We voted to incorporate adjacent properties under HOA oversight last year. Notice was provided to all affected landowners. When no response or dues were received for 3 consecutive months, foreclosure proceedings began automatically." I opened the envelope. Inside were copies of certified letters addressed to my father, who had been deceased for over a year, demanding payment of community integration fees and threatening consequences for non-compliance. They had sent notices to a dead man and then seized his property when he didn't respond. "My father passed away. I've been deployed. This is illegal, and you know it." Marcus shrugged, examining his manicured nails. "The board's decision is final. You have 48 hours to remove personal items before the property is fully secured. We already have interested buyers for this eyesore." An older woman with a gardening hat watched from across the street, watering flowers that were identical to every other house's landscape package. 2 men in golf attire stood nearby, nodding approvingly. These people, my new neighbors, were watching my family legacy being stolen and treating it like an amusing afternoon spectacle. I pulled out my phone and called my lawyer. The look on Marcus's face when I mentioned the words illegal seizure and veterans' property protections gave me the first hint of satisfaction I'd felt since arriving. This wasn't just about a farm anymore. This was about justice, legacy, and teaching a lesson to those who abuse power simply because they think they can. What I didn't tell Marcus, what I carefully kept to myself as I walked back to my car, with plans already forming, was that I wasn't just fighting for my farm. I was now, quite literally, fighting on my own land. My lawyer, Sarah Connolly, wasn't just good. She was a predator in a pantsuit who specialized in property disputes and veterans' rights. I'd met her through a military buddy who'd faced similar issues with an overzealous city council trying to condemn his property. Within 3 hours of my call, she was parked outside my motel room with 3 file boxes and fire in her eyes. "They picked the wrong farm to steal," she said, spreading documents across the small table. The Service Members' Civil Relief Act specifically protects active duty personnel from exactly this kind of predatory action, and that's just the beginning of their problems. Sarah explained that not only had the HOA violated federal law by pursuing action against me while I was deployed, but they had also failed to follow proper state foreclosure procedures. Their own bylaws required a physical posting of notice for 30 days, verification of receipt of written warnings, and a formal hearing that I would have been entitled to attend. None of that happened, I told her, showing her the envelope with notices all addressed to my deceased father. "They knew exactly what they were doing," she replied, her expression grim. "This Marcus Wellington, I looked him up. He's got a history of aggressive property acquisition. 3 other HOAs he's presided over have foreclosed on at least a dozen properties in similar circumstances. It's a pattern. Despite having the law clearly on my side, getting my farm back wouldn't be instantaneous. The courts moved slowly, and in the meantime, the HOA had physical possession of my property. Sarah filed emergency motions for injunctive relief to prevent them from selling the farm, but we still needed to undergo proper proceedings. Marcus, for his part, seemed unfazed by the legal challenge. The day after receiving our initial filing, he orchestrated a property assessment team to enter my farm. Through the chain-link fence that now surrounded my family's land, I watched as men in khakis measured buildings, photographed equipment, and made notes on clipboards. "Just documenting the condition of community property," Marcus called out when he spotted me watching. "We're thinking a community garden would be perfect here, or maybe tennis courts." I remained silent, though my hands clenched into fists at my sides. Sarah had been clear: no confrontations, no threats, nothing that could be used against me in court. But it took every ounce of military discipline not to hop that fence and physically remove them from my property. The situation escalated further when I discovered that the HOA had begun selling off farm equipment to recover costs. My grandfather's 1952 Ford tractor, the one he'd taught me to drive when I was 9, was listed in an online auction. Family heirlooms were being catalogued as abandoned property, despite our active legal case demanding their return. Word spread through the neighborhood. While many residents averted their eyes when I walked past, some began reaching out. Mrs. Hendricks, an elderly widow whose garden backed up to the eastern edge of my farm, approached me at the local diner. They did the same thing to the Andersons. "Last year," she whispered, glancing around nervously, "their daughter was taking care of Mr. Anderson after his stroke. Fell behind 3 months on dues while juggling hospital visits. Next thing they knew, foreclosure notices. The board bought their house at auction for 30 cents on the dollar, sold it 2 months later for full market value." Other stories emerged. The Ramirez family, pressured to remove a wheelchair ramp because it wasn't aesthetically consistent. The Patels, fined daily for religious decorations during Diwali. Marcus and his inner circle had created a climate of fear while enriching themselves through selective enforcement and predatory practices. My initial anger evolved into something more focused, a determination to expose the corruption that had been festering in Meadowcrest Estates. I began documenting everything, collecting testimonies, building a case that went far beyond my own property dispute. 2 weeks after filing our emergency motion, we finally got a court date. The morning of the hearing, Sarah and I arrived to find Marcus and the HOA board already seated with not 1, but 3 attorneys from a prestigious firm known for representing developers. "They're burning association funds to fight this," Sarah whispered as we took our seats. "Must be more at stake than just your farm." The hearing started with the HOA's lead counsel painting me as an absentee owner who had neglected family obligations and was now using military service as an excuse. When they finished their character assassination, Sarah stood up. "Your Honor, before I present our case, I'd like to enter into evidence several documents that fundamentally change the nature of this proceeding." She handed the clerk a folder containing the acquisition papers for Franklin Land Holdings, property maps showing the land trust boundaries, and the registered documents naming me as controlling owner. My client, Sergeant First Class James Blackwood, is not merely fighting for his family farm. As these documents confirm, he is the majority owner of the land trust that owns the ground beneath Meadowcrest Estates. Every home in that development, including Mr. Wellington's, stands on land that Sergeant Blackwood's company has legal title to. The courtroom erupted. Marcus's face turned ash white. His attorneys huddled in panicked whispers. The judge banged his gavel repeatedly until order was restored. "Furthermore," Sarah continued once silence returned, "we're prepared to demonstrate that this seizure was not an isolated incident, but part of a pattern of predatory practices designed to acquire properties at below market values for the personal enrichment of board members." As she spoke, I locked eyes with Marcus across the courtroom. For the first time since I'd returned home, the smug satisfaction was gone from his face. He looked like a man watching his carefully constructed kingdom crumble before his eyes. The judge peered at the documents, then at the HOA's lawyers, who were frantically reviewing the land trust papers, desperately seeking a loophole. He called for a 30-minute recess for both parties to confer. In the hallway outside, Marcus approached me directly for the first time, his attorneys trailing behind, looking concerned. "This is some kind of trick," he hissed, though uncertainty had replaced his usual confidence. "You can't just buy the land underneath an entire development." I smiled for the first time in weeks. "Actually, I can, and I did. Just like you thought you could steal a farm that's been in my family for 6 generations." When court resumed, the energy in the room had transformed completely. The HOA's attorneys requested a 2-week continuance to review the newly presented evidence. Judge Harmon, a no-nonsense veteran himself, denied their request. "The emergency motion before me today is regarding an allegedly illegal seizure of property belonging to a recently returned service member," he stated, glaring over his reading glasses at Marcus and his team. "That matter will be resolved today." Within 30 minutes, the judge had granted our motion for immediate return of my property, issued a restraining order preventing the HOA from entering the farm without permission, and scheduled a full hearing to address damages and potential criminal charges for violation of the Service Members' Civil Relief Act. As we left the courthouse, reporters from the local news station approached us. Word had spread quickly, as it always does when David lands a clean hit on Goliath. Sarah handled most of the questions with practiced ease, but when asked how I felt, I simply said, "My family has farmed that land for generations. All I want is to continue that tradition in peace." The soundbite played on repeat during the evening news, alongside photos of the farm with chains on the gates and Marcus standing guard. By nightfall, the story had been picked up by veteran advocacy groups and several national outlets. Non-farm freedom and HOA reach began trending on social media. My phone rang non-stop with calls from other veterans who'd faced similar situations. Attorneys offering pro bono services and agricultural preservation organizations wanting to support the fight. The farm had become a symbol of something larger than my personal battle. It represented resistance against the unchecked power of entities that preyed on the vulnerable. When I arrived at the farm the next morning, I found the chains already removed and a small group of people waiting by the gate. Among them was Mrs. Hendricks, the elderly neighbor who had first approached me, along with about a dozen other Meadowcrest residents. "We're here to help," said a tall man in his 60s who introduced himself as Frank Calloway. "I've lived here 5 years and never knew half of what was going on behind closed doors at those board meetings." An Asian American woman stepped forward. "I'm Rebecca Chen. I was the first HOA president here. What Marcus has done to this association is unconscionable. He's corrupted everything we built." One by one, neighbors introduced themselves and shared stories of intimidation, selective enforcement, and financial mismanagement. They brought documents, years of meeting minutes, financial statements, copies of violation notices that showed clear patterns of targeting certain homeowners. Rebecca had kept meticulous records even after leaving the board, suspecting something wasn't right with how Marcus operated. "The foreclosure fund," Frank explained, showing me a spreadsheet he'd compiled. "It's supposed to be a reserve account for maintaining foreclosed properties until they can be resold. Over the past 4 years, it's received over $800,000 from association dues. But the expenditures don't add up. Properties were sold too quickly to justify the maintenance costs claimed." Rebecca nodded grimly. "And those properties always seem to end up in the hands of shell companies that trace back to board members or their relatives. They're buying homes at a fraction of market value using association money, then flipping them for personal profit." The picture became clearer with each new piece of evidence. Marcus had transformed the HOA from a community organization into a property acquisition machine. My farm wasn't just an eyesore to him, it was prime real estate surrounded by high-value homes, the perfect centerpiece for a luxury development that would have netted him millions. News of my ownership of the land trust spread through Meadowcrest like wildfire. That afternoon, an emergency HOA meeting was called. Despite the short notice, the community center was packed beyond capacity. Residents who had never attended a meeting before showed up demanding answers. Marcus attempted to maintain control, but the room wasn't having it. When he tried to adjourn without addressing the farm situation, Frank Calloway stood up. "Before we go anywhere, I think we need to hear from our landlord," Frank announced, gesturing toward me at the back of the room. "After all, according to these land trust documents, we're all essentially tenants on his property." The room fell silent as I walked to the front. I hadn't planned to speak, but seeing all those faces, some angry, some frightened, most simply confused, I knew they deserved the truth. "I never intended to be your landlord," I began. "I only discovered the land lease arrangement when researching how to protect my farm from developers. But now that I am in this position, I think we need to talk about how this community operates." For the next hour, I listened more than I spoke. Residents voiced years of frustrations, fears, and questions. Many had no idea they didn't own the land under their homes. The information had been buried in closing documents and never mentioned again. Others were outraged at learning how their dues had been misused. Marcus and his loyalists on the board sat stone-faced as their kingdom crumbled around them. When the financial irregularities were presented by Frank and corroborated by Rebecca, several residents demanded immediate resignations. Others called for a forensic audit. The meeting that had begun with tension ended with a near-unanimous vote to remove the entire board pending investigation. As the crowd dispersed, a veteran in his 70s approached me, leaning heavily on a cane. "I fought in Vietnam," he said, his voice gravelly with emotion. "Came home to people who called me names for doing my duty. Been living here 7 years, and last month they fined me for putting up a flag holder that was non-regulation. Told me my American flag disrupted neighborhood aesthetics." He extended his hand, which I shook firmly. "Thank you for standing up to them. Sometimes the hardest battles are the ones we fight right here at home." That night, as I finally slept in my own farmhouse again, I realized that returning the farm to my possession was just the beginning. The real fight, the one that would define my post-military life, was going to be about justice for an entire community that had been silently suffering under the regime of a petty tyrant. And for the first time since coming home, I felt I had a new mission worthy of the uniform I'd worn. The forensic audit results arrived 3 weeks later, delivered by a somber-faced accountant who laid out the findings to the interim HOA committee in precise, devastating detail. Marcus and his inner circle had misappropriated over $1.2 million in association funds through a sophisticated scheme of fraudulent foreclosures, phantom maintenance expenses, and kickbacks from preferred contractors. The district attorney's office launched a formal investigation the same day, and by sunset, news vans were again parked along Meadowcrest Drive. Marcus hadn't been seen in the neighborhood since the emergency meeting. His house stood empty, lawn beginning to grow beyond the previously mandated 2.5-inch maximum height. Rumors circulated that he'd fled to Florida or Arizona, somewhere with favorable homestead exemption laws to protect assets from the inevitable. Civil suits. He cleared out his accounts 2 days after the court hearing, Sarah told me, as we reviewed the audit findings on my farmhouse porch. But he left behind a paper trail a mile wide. His arrogance will be his undoing. He never thought anyone would dare challenge him. With the immediate threat to my farm neutralized and criminal investigations underway, I turned my attention to the deeper problem: the broken relationship between Meadowcrest Estates and the farm that had become an island within it. For generations, My family had stood apart from the surrounding community, proud of our independence but increasingly isolated. The land trust revelation had given me leverage, but wielding power over my neighbors wasn't my goal. Creating something better was. I called a community meeting on my property, the first time in living memory that Meadowcrest residents had been invited onto the Blackwood Farm en masse. We set up folding chairs in the old apple orchard, and I watched with quiet amazement as over 200 people walked through gates that had been chained shut just weeks before. My grandfather used to say that good fences make good neighbors, I began, standing on the bed of my dad's pickup truck to address the crowd. But I think we've all had enough of barriers in this community. Today, I want to talk about building bridges instead. I outlined a vision that had been forming since the courtroom revelation, a complete restructuring of the relationship between the farm and the development. Rather than maintaining the adversarial division that had defined our coexistence, I proposed integration. The land trust would be reorganized as a community land trust with representatives from both the farm and neighborhood serving as trustees. Homeowners would receive long-term renewable leases at fair rates, eliminating the uncertainty that Marcus had exploited. Most importantly, the farm would become a community resource, not by surrendering our agricultural heritage, but by sharing it. My family has worked this soil for 6 generations, I explained. We've accumulated knowledge about this land that no developer's environmental impact study could ever capture. What if that knowledge became an asset for everyone who lives here, rather than something to be bulldozed for more tennis courts? I proposed converting a portion of the farm into community garden plots, where residents could grow their own food. Under the guidance of experienced farmers, another section would become an agricultural education center, offering workshops on sustainable practices, traditional skills, and food preservation. The century-old barn would be restored as an event space for farmers' markets, community gatherings, and celebrations. But this can't be my project alone, I concluded. If we're going to heal what's been broken here, it has to be a shared effort, a genuine community. The response was overwhelming. People who had never spoken to each other, despite living on the same street for years, began exchanging ideas and contact information. Retired engineers offered to help design irrigation systems for the community gardens. Teachers proposed partnerships with local schools. A group of veterans volunteered to organize the barn restoration. Rebecca Chen, with her experience as the original HOA president, stepped forward to lead the committee drafting new bylaws. Ones focused on true community governance rather than property value enforcement. Frank Calloway took charge of the financial restructuring, determined to create transparency where there had been secretive control. Over the months that followed, Meadowcrest underwent a transformation more profound than any landscape regulation could have achieved. The rigid uniformity that had been Marcus's obsession gave way to thoughtful diversity. Native plant gardens replaced water-hungry lawns. Solar panels appeared on south-facing roofs. Children's laughter returned to front yards that had been eerily silent under the previous regime. As for Marcus, justice arrived with methodical certainty. The district attorney filed multiple felony charges for fraud, embezzlement, and criminal conversion. Civil suits from homeowners who had lost properties in fraudulent foreclosures threatened whatever assets he hadn't managed to hide. His reputation in tatters, he eventually accepted a plea deal that included restitution, probation, and community service hours that would keep him occupied for years. 1 year to the day after finding chains on my gates, I stood in the restored barn surrounded by hundreds of neighbors celebrating our first community harvest festival. Tables groaned under the weight of produce grown in the community gardens. Children ran between hay bales and apple bobbing stations. Elderly residents who had once been afraid to step outside for fear of receiving violation notices now judged In pie contests and taught canning workshops, Mrs. Hendricks, the neighbor who had first approached me with warnings about Marcus, found me near the cider press. "I've lived in Meadowcrest for 12 years, she said, watching as her grandchildren fed apples into the grinder. "This is the first time it's felt like a real home." Later that evening, as the crowd thinned and lanterns glowed softly in the autumn dusk, I walked to the hilltop where my grandfather had taught me to plow straight furrows by keeping my eyes fixed on a distant point. From there, I could see both. The original farmhouse and the surrounding homes of Meadowcrest, no longer divided by invisible lines of resentment and regulation. A voice behind me broke my contemplation. It was Rebecca carrying 2 cups of hot cider. "Penny for your thoughts, landlord," she asked with a smile, handing me a steaming cup. "Just thinking about boundaries," I replied. "How sometimes the greatest freedom comes from removing them." She nodded, looking out over the community we'd helped rebuild. "Your father and grandfather would be proud, you know, not just because you saved the farm, but because you found a way for it to grow in a direction they couldn't have imagined." The next spring, we broke ground on the Blackwood Community Center, built precisely where the farm met the development, straddling what had once been a property line that divided us. The building, constructed with timber from the farm's woodlot and volunteer labor from both sides of that old boundary, housed meeting spaces, classrooms, and offices for the newly formed Community Land Trust. Above its entrance, a simple plaque reads, "Boundaries define us only if we let them. This ground belongs to all of us." Marcus Wellington had tried to seize my family farm, never realizing that true ownership isn't about property lines or legal titles. It's about belonging to the land and to each other. A lesson that 6 generations of Blackwoods had always understood, and that an entire community now embraced as their own. If you enjoyed this true story of standing up against HOA overreach, make sure to smash that subscribe button. Every week on Neighborhood Justice, I bring you incredible stories of ordinary people standing up to power and winning against all odds. Have you ever faced an HOA nightmare? Drop your experience in the comments below, or let me know whose story you want to hear next. Don't forget to like this video and share it with someone who needs to know they're not alone in their fight for justice. Click that notification bell so you never miss a new upload. Next week's story is about a small-town teacher who exposed corruption in her local school board and changed education in her community forever. Join our growing community of over 500,000 justice seekers who believe that standing up for what's right still matters in today's world. Until next time, remember, the most important battles often happen right in your own backyard. This is Veteran Stories, signing off.